The Korean Mafia boss believed his maid was betraying him, so he followed her into the night. He expected secrets. He expected betrayal, maybe even a meeting with his enemies. But what he found wasn't a crime. It was something far worse. It shattered the most feared man in the city. The iron gates of the estate slammed shut behind her. She didn't hesitate. The maid in the red uniform walked fast, almost running, her yellow gloves still on, plastic bags cutting into her fingers. Her breathing was uneven, like she was racing against time itself. From the shadows across the street, he watched Koo Chung-hee, a man whose name alone made grown men lower their voices, a man who built an empire on silence, control, and fear. And tonight, that control was slipping. For weeks, he had seen it. The rushed exits, the trembling hands, the way she avoided his eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. Stephanie Moreno was hiding something. And in Chung-hee's world, people who hid things didn't survive long. So when she disappeared into the city's darkest streets, he made a decision he never made lightly. He stepped out of his car and followed her himself. The residence of Koo Chung-hee was less of a home and more of a silent monument to absolute authority. Known throughout the underworld as the Dragon of the East, Chung-hee lived within a fortress of cold marble and reinforced glass that overlooked the city like a watchful predator. Every inch of the estate reflected his personality, precise, expensive, and devoid of warmth. In this world, silence was the standard, and any deviation from the established order was treated as a threat. Stephanie Moreno moved through this temple of steel as an invisible ghost. To the security teams at the gates and the lieutenants whispering in the hallways, she was merely a fixture of the house, no more significant than the Italian leather sofas or the ancient Ming vases she dusted with practiced care. Clad in her red uniform and a gray apron that bore the faint, stubborn stains of industrial cleaners, she performed her duties with a mechanical efficiency that kept her beneath the radar of the dragon's sharp eyes. She was the one who erased the traces of his existence, the fingerprints on the mahogany desk, the ash from his expensive cigars, and the remnants of meals he rarely finished. Chung-hee spent his mornings in the glass-walled study, a room where millions were moved with a single keystroke, and lives were altered with a quiet nod. He was a man who lived by the clock, his life a series of calculated movements and cold assessments. He wore his black suits like armor, the open collar of his shirt occasionally revealing the dark, intricate coils of a dragon tattoo that climbed his chest, a permanent reminder of the violence that had paid for this luxury. From his desk, he could see Stephanie working in the garden or polishing the floor of the grand foyer. To him, she was a shadow in a red dress, a necessary part of the machine that allowed him to focus on the expansion of his empire. However, the air in the mansion had begun to grow heavy with a different kind of tension. Chung-hee, a man whose survival depended on noticing the slightest shift in the wind, began to feel a fracture in the routine. He noticed the way Stephanie's shoulders remained hunched, even when she thought she was alone. He noticed how her yellow-gloved hands would sometimes pause mid-motion, her gaze drifting toward the tall iron gates with a look of suppressed panic. Most of all, he noticed the exhaustion that seemed to be hollowing out her face, a weariness that went deeper than a 12-hour shift could explain. In the dragon's domain, secrets were the only currency that mattered. And for the first time in years, he realized that the most mysterious person in his house was the woman who had been hiding in plain sight. The shift began not with a grand betrayal, but with a whisper in the pantry. Koo Chung-hee was a man who accounted for every bullet and every cent, and that same obsession with precision trickled down to the very calories consumed within his walls. When the head chef, a man who feared the dragon's silence more than a kitchen fire, approached him in the study, his voice was thin with hesitation. He reported a series of minor but consistent discrepancies. A portion of braised wagyu missing here, a bundle of organic greens vanished there, and a container of expensive broth gone from the cold storage. In the world of the Mafia, there was no such thing as a small theft. To Chung-hee, a missing scrap of food was a crack in the foundation of his fortress. It suggested a lack of fear, or worse, a breach of loyalty. His mind, conditioned by decades of backstabbing and street wars, immediately went to the darkest possibility: Food was often used as a currency in the slums. Perhaps his invisible maid was paying off a debt to a rival gang, or worse, feeding information to someone waiting in the tall grass outside his gates. He sat behind his desk, the smoke from his cigar curling around the dragon tattoo on his chest like a living shadow. He thought of Stephanie, the way her yellow gloves gripped the trash bags, the way she avoided his gaze during his morning briefings. He realized now that her tired expression wasn't just physical exhaustion. It was the look of someone carrying a secret that was getting heavier by the hour. The suspicion began to burn in his chest, a cold, focused fire that demanded a resolution. "Don't mention this to anyone else," Chung-hee told the chef, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "Continue the inventory as usual." As the chef hurried away, Chung-hee leaned back in his leather chair, his eyes fixed on the security monitors. He watched Stephanie through a graining lens as she moved through the kitchen, her movements hurried, her eyes darting toward the clock. She wasn't just a maid anymore. In his eyes, she had become a target. He didn't call his security team. He didn't alert his lieutenants. If there was a rat in his house, he would be the one to catch it. His suspicion had hardened into a mission. He would let her finish her shift. He would let her leave with whatever she had hidden in those plastic bags, and then he would follow her into the night to see exactly who was being fed at his expense. The dragon was no longer just watching. He was hunting. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the city in a bruised purple twilight as the mansion gates groaned open for Stephanie's departure. Chung-hee didn't use the SUV this time. Its engine was too distinctive, its presence too loud for the narrow veins of the city he was about to enter. Instead, he stepped out into the damp evening air, his black suit blending into the growing shadows. He kept a precise distance, a ghost in Italian leather, tracking a flash of red fabric through the crowded transit hubs and down into the bowels of the city. As they crossed the tracks into the districts where the streetlights were more often broken than lit, the atmosphere shifted. The polished glass and steel of his world gave way to crumbling brick and the smell of industrial exhaust and stagnant rain. Stephanie moved with a frantic, rhythmic pace, her yellow gloves peeking out from her apron pocket like a warning flag. She didn't look back once. Her focus was entirely on the path ahead, her body, language radiating a singular, desperate mission that made Chung-hee's suspicion grow teeth. They moved deeper into the forgotten zones, places where the law was a suggestion and fear was the local currency. Chung-hee felt the familiar weight of the briefcase in his hand and the hidden coldness of the steel tucked against his ribs. But for the first time, he felt like an intruder in his own territory. He watched as Stephanie navigated alleys so narrow, the sky was just a sliver of gray above them. She dodged a group of loiterers with a practiced ease that suggested this wasn't a detour. This was her reality. The contrast was staggering. He was a man who commanded the very streets they walked upon. Yet seeing her navigate this decay in her pristine servant's red uniform made him feel strangely small. Every few blocks, she would adjust the heavy plastic bags, her breath hitching in the cold air. The scraps she had taken from his table were being carried like holy relics through the mud. Finally, she turned into a street that seemed to be held together only by shadows and prayer. The buildings here were skeletons of their former selves, with boarded windows and doors that hung loosely on rusted hinges. Stephanie stopped in front of a particularly dilapidated tenement, her shoulders dropping for a split second as if the weight of the bags had finally won. She disappeared into the maw of a dark stairwell. Chung-hee waited in the mouth of the alley, his heart drumming a slow, steady rhythm against his ribs. The hunt was over, and as he moved toward the peeling door to see what lay within, the dragon realized he was no longer looking for a traitor. He was looking for the truth. The air inside the tenement was thick with the scent of damp concrete and the metallic tang of a failing radiator. Chung-hee moved like a predator through the dim hallway, his polished shoes silent against the cracked linoleum. He followed the faint sound of a humming melody, a low, mournful tune that felt out of place in such a desolate skeleton of a building. It led him to a door that didn't quite fit its frame, slightly ajar, allowing a sliver of the flickering light to spill into the corridor. He pressed his back against the peeling wallpaper and looked through the gap. This wasn't a meeting place for soldiers or a stash house for stolen goods. It was a tomb for the living. The room was subterranean, a basement unit where the walls wept with moisture and a single bare bulb struggled against the gloom. In the corner, huddled beneath a mountain of threadbare blankets, sat an elderly man. His hair was a shock of white, his eyes milky and distant, staring at a world that only he could see. Stephanie was already in motion. She had stripped off her gray apron, but her red uniform remained, a vibrant wound in the center of the gray room. With her yellow gloves still on, she was frantically scrubbing a patch of black mold near the man's head, her breath hitching in her chest. "I'm here, Papa," she whispered, her voice cracking with a tenderness that Chung-hee had never heard in his mansion. "I brought you a feast from the palace. The king himself sent it for you." Chung-hee watched, motionless as she carefully opened the plastic bags. With the grace of a high-end server, she plated the remnants of the Wagyu beef and the vibrant vegetables on a chipped ceramic saucer. She sat on the edge of the milk crate that served as a chair and began to feed the old man, piece by tiny piece. The man chewed slowly, a ghost of a smile touching his lips as he tasted the luxury of a world he would never visit. "Is the king kind to you, Stephanie?" the old man rasped, his voice a dry leaf skittering on pavement. Stephanie paused, a piece of meat trembling between her fingers. She looked around the crumbling room, at the buckets catching leaks and the shadows encroaching from the corners. "The kindest," she lied, her eyes brimming with tears she refused to let fall. "He watches over everything, Papa. We are safe because of him." Outside the door, the dragon of the east felt a coldness spread through his veins that no winter could match. He looked down at his briefcase, filled with the paperwork of a multi-million-dollar empire, and then back at the woman using her cleaning gloves to provide dignity to a dying man. The suspicion that had fueled his hunt vanished, replaced by a crushing weight of shame. He had come here expecting to find a criminal. Instead, he had found the only person in the city who truly knew the meaning of loyalty. As he watched her wipe a stray drop of broth from her father's chin, the iron foundations of Chung-hee's world began to crumble. The walk back to the estate felt longer than the journey into the slums. The city, which usually hummed with the electric pulse of his power, now seemed to scream of his neglect. Every shadow he passed felt like a witness to his ignorance. When the massive iron gates of the mansion finally hummed open to receive him, the luxury he had spent a lifetime accumulating felt like a shroud. The Italian marble in the foyer was no longer a symbol of status. It was a cold, unforgiving surface that Stephanie had scrubbed on her hands and knees before returning to a basement that smelled of rot. Chung-hee entered his study and did not turn on the lights. He allowed the moonlight to filter through the floor-to-ceiling glass, casting long, skeletal shadows across the room. He set his briefcase on the desk, the same desk where he signed off on shipments that poisoned neighborhoods just like the one he had just left. For the first time, he didn't see the numbers or the logistics. He saw the king Stephanie had described to her father. He saw a man who sat in a castle of glass while the woman who kept it clean fought a war against mold and hunger in the dark. He walked over to the antique mirror hanging on the far wall, a piece worth more than the entire tenement block he had just visited. In the silvered glass, he saw the man the world feared, the dragon of the East. He saw the sharp, expensive suit that didn't have a single crease, the gold chain that glinted like a predator's eye, and the dark ink of the dragon tattoo peeking out from his collar. But the reflection felt like a stranger. He looked at his hands, the hands that had held weapons and signed death warrants, and realized they had never done anything as truly brave as what Stephanie did every night with a pair of yellow rubber gloves. The silence of the mansion, which he usually found restorative, was now deafening. It was the silence of an empty heart. He thought of the feast he had supposedly sent, the scraps of Wagyu that he had considered trash. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't a king, he was a monster who had mistaken his own cruelty for strength. He had built a kingdom on the backs of people he didn't even bother to see. As he stared into his own intense, serious eyes, the composure that had made him a legend began to fracture. The dragon wasn't just suspicious anymore. He was disgusted. He realized that if he didn't change what the mirror showed him tomorrow, then he truly was the villain in the fairy tale Stephanie was telling her father. The next morning, the mansion felt colder than the basement floor. Chung-hee had stood upon just hours before. He waited in the shadows of the industrial kitchen, the scent of expensive coffee and cold steel hanging in the air. He didn't sit, he stood by the central island, his black suit a stark, dark silhouette against the white marble. When the service door finally creaked open, Stephanie Moreno slipped inside, her head bowed, her movements already heavy with the weight of a new day. She didn't see him at first. She moved straight to the pantry, her hands trembling as she reached for a small container of leftover braised short ribs from the previous night's gala. "The inventory is short again, Stephanie." The voice was a low, dangerous vibration that seemed to rattle the copper pots hanging from the ceiling. Stephanie froze, the container slipping from her fingers and hitting the floor with a dull thud. She spun around, her face instantly drained of color, her eyes wide with a terror that went far deeper than the fear of losing a job. She looked at Chung-hee, the dragon of the East, standing there with his arms crossed, the light catching the gold chain at his throat and the dark ink of the dragon on his chest. "Mr. Koo," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. She dropped to her knees, her yellow cleaning gloves clutching at her gray apron as if it could shield her from his gaze. I can explain. Please." Chung-hee didn't move. He watched her, his expression unreadable, his heart a leaden weight. "You've been taking things, Stephanie. Every night, bags filled with food, bags filled with supplies." He stepped closer, his polished shoes clicking rhythmically against the floor. "I followed you last night. I saw where you went." The silence that followed was suffocating. Stephanie's breath came in ragged, shallow hitches. She looked up at him, tears finally breaking and tracing hot paths through the dust and exhaustion on her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "My father, he doesn't know where he is anymore. He's hungry, and it's so cold in that room. I didn't want to steal, but the king's table has so much, and he has so little." She bowed her head until her forehead touched the cold marble. "Please don't call the police. Kill me if you have to, but please, don't let him starve alone." Chung-hee looked down at the woman he had called invisible for so long. He saw the frayed edges of her sleeves and the way her entire body shook with the effort of protecting a man who couldn't even remember her name. The high-tension moment he had envisioned as a trial had become his own execution. He reached down, his large, tattooed hand hovering over her shoulder. For a second, she flinched, expecting a blow. But when his hand finally landed, it was as light as a feather, and for the first time in his life, the dragon's voice broke. "Get up, Stephanie," he whispered, his own eyes burning. "The king is done watching. It's time he started acting like one." The kitchen was silent enough to hear the steady, rhythmic drip of a leaking faucet, but the atmosphere had shifted from the cold bite of an execution to the heavy, solemn air of a sanctuary. Chung-hee didn't pull his hand away from Stephanie's shoulder. Instead, he gripped it with a firm, grounding pressure that forced her to stop trembling. He looked at his men, the silent, stone-faced soldiers who'd been waiting for the signal to discard a thief, and saw their confusion. To them, the dragon's world was binary, loyalty or elimination. But today, the dragon was rewriting the laws of his own empire. "Marco," Chung-hee said, his voice regaining its razor-sharp authority, though the edge was now tempered with a strange, new urgency. "Take 3 men. Go to the address I tracked last night. There's an elderly man in the basement unit. He is to be moved immediately." Stephanie looked up, her eyes wide with a fresh surge of panic. "Mr. Koo, please, he's confused. He doesn't understand." "He doesn't need to understand," Chung-hee interrupted, though not unkindly. He looked down at her, seeing not a maid in a stained apron, but the woman who had called him a king to comfort a dying man. "He is being moved to the East Wing. The guest suites. The ones with the floor-to-ceiling windows and the heated floors. He will never be cold again, Stephanie, and neither will you." The command sent a shockwave through the room. The East Wing was reserved for visiting dignitaries and high-ranking associates. It was a place of silk sheets and quiet luxury, miles away from the damp concrete of the slums. Marco hesitated for only a fraction of a second before nodding and disappearing through the service door. Chung-hee turned back to Stephanie and reached down, taking her gloved hands in his own. He gently began to peel away the yellow rubber, revealing skin that was cracked and raw from hours of industrial chemicals. He looked at the damage, the physical cost of his perfect household, and felt the shame tighten its grip on his heart. "The red uniform stays in the laundry," he said softly. "You are no longer a ghost in this house. You are a guest. Your father will have the best doctors money can buy, and you will sit at the table, not stand beside it." Stephanie could only stare at him, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the reality of his words began to sink in. She had expected a grave. He was giving her a palace. As the mansion began to buzz with a different kind of activity, men moving furniture, maids preparing linens for a guest they used to ignore, Chung-hee realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't issuing an order to protect his power. He was issuing an order to protect his soul. The dragon's domain was still a fortress, but the gates were no longer meant only to keep the world out. They were finally opening to let the humanity in. The transformation of the East Wing happened with the same lethal efficiency Chung-hee usually reserved for his business operations. By the following afternoon, the silent hallways were no longer empty. Instead of stone-faced guards, the corridors were occupied by a team of the city's most elite neurologists and private nurses, men and women whose services were usually reserved for presidents and kings. Equipment that hummed with life-saving precision was wheeled past the Italian tapestries, and the scent of antiseptic began to compete with the mansion's usual aroma of beeswax and old money. Stephanie's father, Elias, lay in a bed that looked out over the manicured gardens, his frail form swallowed by Egyptian cotton sheets. He was no longer a ghost hidden in a basement. He was the most protected man in the city. The specialists moved around him with a quiet reverence, aware that the man in the sharp black suit watching from the doorway was not merely a benefactor, but the dragon himself. Chung-hee did not return to his study. He did not check the fluctuating markets or take the meetings his lieutenants were desperate to schedule. Instead, he stood guard at the threshold of the guest suite. His briefcase was gone, replaced by a quiet, brooding vigilance. He watched as the doctors performed their assessments, his eyes tracking every flicker of the monitors. When Elias became agitated, confused by the sudden change from his dark cellar to this palace of light, it was not the nurses who calmed him first. It was the presence of the man in the doorway. Chung-hee realized that for years, he had used his reputation to instill a fear that kept people away. Now he was using that same reputation to ensure that no one, not even death itself, would enter this room without his permission. He stood there for hours, a sentinel of a different kind. He watched Stephanie, who had finally traded her red uniform for soft clothes provided by the estate, as she sat by her father's side. She no longer wore the yellow gloves. Her hands, now treated with healing balms, held her father's hand with a peace that the mansion had never known. At one point, one of the doctors approached Chung-hee, speaking in hushed, professional tones about long-term care and the slow progress of cognitive decline. Chung-hee listened with an intensity that made the physician stumble over his words. The boss wasn't looking for a quick fix or a strategic advantage. He was looking at the old man's face, seeing the dignity that was slowly returning as the grime of the slums was washed away. "Do whatever is necessary," Chung-hee said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the room. "Whatever he needs, the Empire provides." As night fell, the dragon remained at his post. He wasn't guarding a stash of narcotics or a vault of gold. He was guarding a father's right to remember his daughter's name. In the stillness of the East Wing, the man who had built his life on taking realized that the greatest power he had ever wielded was the power to keep a single flickering light from going out. 6 months later, the city's skyline remained the same. But the heart of the dragon's empire had undergone a quiet, radical surgery. Chung-hee still sat at the mahogany desk in his glass-walled study, and his name still commanded a silence that could freeze a room. But the directives flowing from his pen no longer carried the scent of gunpowder. The ledgers that once tracked the movement of illicit shipments now recorded the construction of community clinics in the forgotten districts, and the establishment of a foundation that turned invisible workers into protected citizens. He had realized that a true king doesn't rule through the fear of his subjects, but through his ability to shield them from the dark. In the East Wing, the clinical silence had been replaced by the soft, steady hum of a life reclaimed. Elias sat in a high-backed armchair by the window, his breathing deep and unlabored. Though the fog in his mind never fully cleared, there were moments of lucidity, brief, golden windows where he would recognize the man who often came to sit with him. Chung-hee had become a frequent visitor, trading the briefcase for a board of Go, playing in a companionable silence that bridged the gap between their two worlds. The dragon had learned that there was a specific kind of strength in patience, a virtue he had once dismissed as a weakness. Stephanie Moreno was no longer a shadow in a red uniform. She moved through the mansion with a quiet grace, her hands no longer hidden in yellow rubber, but free to garden or hold a book. She had become the conscience of the estate, the person who reminded the most dangerous man in the city of the world that existed beyond the iron gates. The theft of the Wagyu had become a distant memory, replaced by a reality where there was always enough at the table for everyone. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the city in hues of copper and bruised violet, Chung-hee joined Stephanie on the wide stone terrace. They stood together, looking out over the sprawling metropolis. From this height, the neighborhoods where broken windows were once the only soundtrack now looked like a tapestry of light. The wrong that Chung-hee used to hunt had been replaced by a mission of restoration. He felt the weight of the gold chain at his neck and the ink of the dragon on his chest, but they no longer felt like a burden of guilt. They were the markers of a man who had used his power to build a fortress that actually meant something. "The city looks different tonight," Stephanie whispered, her voice steady and at peace. Chung-hee watched the light catch the distant windows of the neighborhoods he once exploited. He thought of the basement where he had found her, and the palace he had tried to build alone. He realized then that he hadn't saved her. She had saved him from the empty monument of his own life. The dragon of the East turned away from the view to look at the woman beside him, his expression serious, but finally, truly calm. "It looks like a home," he replied. And as the last sliver of the sun vanished behind the horizon, the broken boss realized he was finally whole.